Hey everyone, welcome to the Dyl Pickle Movie Network. I am Dylan Randazzo, and I'm very excited to finally wrap up my retrospective for 2014. The past few years, I've been doing these retrospectives, looking at films from 10 years ago, films that I grew up with, seeing in the theaters, and seeing how they held up 10 years later in 2024. Some of these movies have held up extremely well, and some movies don't. And I think that's the magic of watching these movies with 10 years removed from it, to just kind of see where tastes have changed, where tastes have aligned, and to see some new kind of hidden gems that I didn't expect kind of arise out of the shadows. And if you want to see who I would award all my tech prizes and acting prizes and all my Oscars to, you can check out a video I did a few weeks ago where I gave my nominations for the films of 2014. But this is just my straight up top 14 of 2014. I'm not going to get into any honorable mentions. If you want to know about all the other films I've seen in 2014 and what I think of them, you can check out my Letterboxd, where I have ranked all 90 films that I've seen from the year of 2014. Some I saw back then, some I revisited this time, some I discovered for the first time this time for this retrospective. So I will link that link in the description below so you can go and look at all those films displayed out. But this is just going to be the top 14. This is going to be the creme de la creme. It was very hard consolidating it to just 14 films, and I'm glad I don't have to just do a top 10 because these extra 4 films just add so much texture to this list that I think is going to be really worth mentioning. And a lot of these films maybe you haven't heard of that I hope I can bring a light to and hope that you can go seek out for yourselves, because they're all great films in their own rights. And some of these films I did talk about on Picture This already when I covered Best Picture nominees, including my number 14. So I'm not going to go super in depth on these ones, but my number 14 is The Imitation Game, directed by Morton Tildum. This, of course, follows the story of Alan Turing and his huge impact on Enigma and code breaking that led to the resolution of World War II. It's such a great story in terms of its war elements, the way they kind of depict Enigma and show that kind of race against the clock, even though it does kind of fit some of the genre biopic kind of traps of everything happening all at once and not necessarily being a historically accurate 100% of the way through retelling of events. But I think for a film and a dramatized version of the story, I think this is the best you could get from this story. I think what they do in diving into Alan Turing's past and his tragedy and his upbringing and what has brought him to this moment is really, really sad to see, but really, really well done in the film. I think the acting from both the adult and child actors in this film is fantastic. I think Benedict Cumberbatch, this is probably still my favorite role of his. Just all the minor little quirks and mannerisms he brings to Alan Turing, but also not necessarily overdoing it in the way that some biopic performances do, where they're really kind of going for that Oscar and going strong and going hard. He really keeps it more laid back and simple and lets a lot of the stuff kind of simmer below the surface and allow for the audience to kind of really want to lean in and tap into who this guy is. It's a really heartbreaking story, but one that I really enjoy every time I watch it. This would have been like a top 5 film when it came out 10 years ago for me, and I really enjoyed seeing it in the theater. But I think with more time, I just have kind of my tastes have changed. I'm not as big a biopic guy, but I do really like this one. I think this is one of the stronger biopics of recent memory that I can think of.
What is it that we're really doing?
We're going to break an unbreakable Nazi code and win the war.
Oh.
At number 13, we have a horror film. This is The Babadook by Jennifer Kent. First off, Jennifer Kent, Australian cinema. I love what Australia is doing with horror cinema. I just loved Talk to Me a few years ago, was another great piece of Australian horror cinema. So the Australians do it really, really well, and The Babadook is no exception.
If it's in a word or it's in a look, you can't get rid of the Babadook.
And what I love about The Babadook is that the horror doesn't just come from these images and these sounds of this guy lurking at night, and if you hear the knock on the door 3 times, the Babadook appears type thing. It's almost a little akin to Beetlejuice, but in a much darker, scary way. But that's not the horror for me. The horror is seeing, this dramatic story unfold with this mother taking care of her kid, being a single mom, and kind of the trauma that builds up from her husband's death, his father's death, and how there's so much unresolved tension there. And you start to see the tension brew as the more psychological, horrific stuff is going on. It's a really great marrying of family drama and horror that I think makes some of the most fascinating horror nowadays. Something like Hereditary is another example of a film that does this, where it's really centered around a family and their drama more so than it is the horror of it all, but there is still great horror to be found. I think Essie Davis and Noah Wiseman give 2 of the best performances of that year. Essie Davis in particular is one of of the greatest horror performances I've ever seen as this mother trying to grapple with this trauma and this PTSD while also managing her son as a single mother, while also being haunted by this lurking creature of the Babadook. It's just such a great, multi-layered, just well-rounded performance that I think deserved a lot more attention in awards consideration. But this is a film that has stuck with me beyond the years that it has come out, and I think every time I revisit this, I get more and more from it. I find it just as scary as I did the time before, even more so scary, which is very hard to be said about a horror film. Is you really want to make sure that those thrills and the fear really does still hold up after every repeated viewing. In some horror films that doesn't happen, but I think with the Babadook it definitely does. So this is definitely the marquee horror film of 2014 for me. Moving on to my favorite animated film of 2014, at number 12, we have The Lego Movie, directed by Phil Lord and Christopher Miller from 2014. I mean, everyone's probably seen The Lego Movie.
Crank up those subwoofers, dude, and check this out.
But I think, with a few years removed from the Lego Movie, I almost kind of forgot what made the Lego Movie so brilliant, because the comedy is great. The animation is obviously splendid to see. The characters are really likable. The voice acting is great. But when that film gets to its final act and that kind of curtain is raised and that fourth wall is broken, that was a moment that when I saw it 10 years ago, I was just gobsmacked. I couldn't believe what was happening. And I still feel that way today, where that final moment comes and I'm like, wow, they're really going there. They're really doing this. They're really kind of going the extra mile. And for a film that seems like it could just be this like really easy way to sell toys and this kind of marketing ploy, I feel like this movie kind of feels very similar to something like Barbie, where it's like, yes, it can exist to sell a product and to celebrate a product, but it can also have a lot of deeper meaning, a lot of deeper satire, and it can really tell a very intriguing, beautiful story about humanity all at once. And I really love that about the Lego Movie. I think it's a film that, while the comedy beats I can kind of see coming every time and aren't as surprising for me, I still think the comedy is really well done.
Jumping jacks, hit him. 1, 2, 3.
It's the dramatic elements of its finale, of its final act, that really still resonate with me, really stick with me, and really surprise me to this day. So it has got to be in a list of top 14, even though I do think all the animation of 2014 is pretty solid. I mean, you have The Tale of the Princess Kaguya, which is gorgeous. Big Hero 6 is a lot of fun. How to Train Your Dragon 2, while probably my least favorite of that trilogy, is still really strong. So I think 2014 is a really great year for animation, but I do think the Lego Movie is the one that is just the most singular, the most unique, and has the most interesting stuff to say, and has the most surprise of any of these films, because you look at this film and it shouldn't work. I mean, when these trailers came out, so many people were saying, like, really, a Lego Movie? This movie's just for kids. I'm not going to bother with it. And I was one of those people as well. I didn't see it till after the fact on Blu-ray, and I adored it. So I'm very happy that the Lego Movie was this kind of unicorn of a film. And I don't think they've been able to replicate it since, as much as they've tried to expand this franchise. I think this is such a singular first film that cannot be replicated because it's so good.
Pow. Wham. First try.
Moving on to my number 11, just outside the top 10, we have The Normal Heart, directed by Ryan Murphy of Glee fame. This film centers around the very early start of the AIDS crisis in the early 1980s, and deals a lot with the politics of the time and having to get the government response to this crisis and the government acknowledgement of this crisis.
You're accusing the government of a conspiracy to murder all gay men?
Yes.
You start to see how these gay activists kind of come together to try to make their voices heard and get the urgency out there for the AIDS crisis. It is one of those message pictures, but it's also a biopic. But what really stands out about this film to me is the acting. The acting is across the board some of the best acting I've seen in any movie.
What happens to people who can't be as strong as you want them to be?
They're going to cancel our health insurance. They're going to put us into camps. They're going to quarantine us.
It's got one of the most stacked casts I've ever seen on paper, but each and every one of those actors delivers. You have Mark Ruffalo in the leading role. You have Matt Bomer in a terrific, heartbreaking supporting role. You have Taylor Kitsch, Jim Parsons, Alfred Molina, Julia Roberts, Joe Mantello, B.D. Wong, Jonathan Groff, Dennis O'Hare. I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on and on. And all these performances are right on par with one another. There's not one single performance that stands above the rest. They are all on equal footing. And it's really hard in a film with so many stars, in such an ensemble effort, to see, all the actors working in such tandem with one another, where no one sticks out as a sore thumb, but no one sticks out as the sure highlight. I think if I had to pick a favorite, it would be Matt Bomer in this film for what he's doing, because he has the most dramatic chops to really sink into. But I think every actor has their moment to shine.
How are they going to help us if they don't know who we are?
They won't help us, Ned, if they do.
And this movie itself just has such important stuff to say. And I know nowadays, I feel like society at large is very well educated about the AIDS crisis, but I discovered this film when I was only 16 years old. I was 16 when this movie came out, and I was doing a production of Rent, and I actually wanted to research more about HIV and AIDS and kind of just tap into the times and see what the attitudes of the people of the time were, both those suffering with AIDS and those who didn't know about it or wanted to get educated or didn't know about it enough to get educated. And this was a real source of learning for me. I watched this film a bunch when I was 16 doing that show, Rent, because it deals with similar themes, even though it's a little bit tonally different. And I learned just so much from this film. And even to this day, while it doesn't hit the same dramatic heights, because I have seen it all before and none of it surprises me, it still really took me back to that time where I was learning about some serious topics. And I think for someone who might not know as much about the AIDS crisis, because, this newer generation, it's not as prevalent in our news and in our topics today that we talk about on the news. But I think, this is a film that could teach so much while also still being engaging and entertaining and having such great performances. It really is just one of those great, just perfect films for what it is and what it's trying to say. And I think it deserved all the Emmy nominations it got.
You can't stop fighting for the ones you love.
Moving on to my top 10, kicking off with a documentary. This is Life Itself, directed by Steve James. This is the documentary about Roger Ebert. Roger Ebert, of course, had such an impact on what I do, on why I love doing what I do, and me addressing you and telling you about movies. And this film really captures that spirit of Roger Ebert, the spirit that was not ashamed to call out a film for what it was and being brutally honest about it, but also understanding that film is such an evolving, changing, art form, and that we respond to it at different points in our lives, and our attitudes, how we approach cinema can always change one day to the next.
For me, the movies are like a machine that generates empathy. It lets you understand hopes, aspirations, dreams, and fears.
And just in a broader sense, just what life itself means, not just in the form of cinema, but how you approach your life and what you take for granted versus what you don't, and the people you surround yourselves with, the attitudes that change when life kind of has its more dramatic moments to it. And you can start to see how a lot of the philosophy of Roger Ebert's real life and his critic, sensibilities kind of converge. Just a beautiful film to honor such a beautiful soul and a beautiful voice in the field that I'm most passionate about. And it doesn't have a lot of frills and a lot of bells and whistles. This documentary is just pretty straightforward, but I think that's kind of the documentary I think Roger Ebert would have wanted, is something a little bit more baseline, straightforward, just telling an honest and earnest story. And that's what this film does. So I think it's the documentary that Ebert would have loved and give 2 thumbs up. And I'm giving it 2 thumbs up and putting it here in my top 10.
He made it possible for a bigger audience, a wider audience, to appreciate cinema as an art form because he really loved films.
At number 9, we have the Dardennes film, 2 Days, One Night. This stars Marion Cotillard as a woman who basically suffers an incident involving mental illness, and then she returns to her job only to find out that because of her return to her job, all the bonuses that the rest of the workers at her company were going to get are no longer going to exist. So the dilemma is either we rehire her and you guys lose your bonuses, or we don't hire her back and you all get to keep your bonus. And it's a very, very interesting morality play in the fact that this woman really wants to fight for her job, for her survival, for her livelihood. And in doing so, she approaches each and every one of the workplace people and tries to convince them to let her keep her job, because this deals a lot with selfishness and the idea of when you're given a choice of this, of like, do I want this raise or do I want this woman to have a livelihood and have a job? It's a very tough decision because you have to weigh your personal selfishness versus the selflessness of helping others, but also understanding that like this could change your life and this is not going to benefit you. This is only going to benefit someone else. And I think it's a very interesting morality dilemma. And the Dardennes just have such a good naturalistic approach to their filmmaking, where you see this woman just kind of going door to door, talking and just having these discussions. There's really no frills to be had. I talked about Life Itself, how it didn't have frills. This really doesn't have any frills. It's so slice of life. It's so in the moment, but I think that's what makes it so familiar and accessible and relatable. And I watched this film and I have never been in a circumstance like this, but I did start to weigh like where I would fit in the circumstance. Would I be the selfless person? Would I be the selfish person? And I think this movie kind of lets you analyze that and think for yourself and kind of put yourself in a very interesting, rare scenario. This is a kind of weird pitch for a movie because it doesn't feel like it's a very cinematic thing. But I think because of the Dardennes and their style of filmmaking and the way they're able to still make it engaging, even though it's kind of the same act repeated over and over and over again, it's woman comes to door, knocks on door, sees the coworker and explains the dilemma and why they should let her keep her job. She does that basically every single time. But the little tweaks between each conversation are what makes the magic of this film. Marion Cotillard got a Best Actress nomination for this, as she should have. I think it's an exceptional performance, and it's a film that just really surprised me, and I'm really excited that I finally got around to after hearing so many great things from so many great comrades and friends. I'm very glad I got to finally see this with my own eyes and just enjoy it for what it is.
C'est pas de ta faute s'ils perdent leur prime parce que tu restes. Leur dire que tu veux garder ton travail, que tu as besoin de ton salaire. C'est pour ça qu'il faut aller les voir un par un.
At number 8, we have a Denis Villeneuve film. We have Enemy. Now, Denis Villeneuve has obviously made a huge name for himself with movies like Blade Runner 2049 and Arrival and the Dune movies. And when we think of those movies, we think of these grand, sweeping, big blockbuster, huge, spectacle-driven films. But it's really cool to just go back to the roots of Denis Villeneuve and realize that he was so interesting when he was also tackling these smaller, more contained stories. And this film follows a guy who sees himself in a movie and realizes that he has a doppelganger who looks just like him. And you start to see, is this a twin? Is this a, kind of made up version of himself? Is this just a guy who looks like him? Is this a guy who is a clone of him? And I'm not going to tell you the answer to any of that, but I think it's really cool to see how this film explores that and start to see how the visual metaphors creep in involving masculinity and the way this man sees the world, and extensively how Denis Villeneuve sees this world. And speaking of the world, I love how it's kind of basked in this like yellow hue. It has a very distinct visual style. There are a lot of really interesting visual things going on here. It's just one of those films that's really hard to talk about because there's so many ins and outs that I guess could get into like spoilery territory that I don't want to get into here now, because also when I start to talk about this film, I can go on for like 30, 40, 50 minutes just trying to analyze a single frame of it. But I love the films that do that. I love the films that have you thinking about them and just really trying to engage with them and think about them on a deeper level. And I think Enemy is one of those that does. And it features not one, but two great Jake Gyllenhaal performances, which I'll just say right now, we're not done with him. He's coming up again later on this list, so stay tuned. Moving on to number 7, the Best Picture winner of that year, Birdman. This is a film that I thought I would like less on a rewatch, but I liked it even more on a rewatch. I think just being in the theater community and seeing all the ins and outs of what happens backstage, I think this film really captures super well. There is this one-take gimmick that some people could say is just a gimmick, but I think it works really well in showing the constant mania of live theater and showing the liveness of theater. The fact that the camera doesn't cut in theater. There are no cameras to cut. It's just this continuous thing. And I think that really works well with the style that they're bringing to this film. I think it is a deserved Best Picture winner, even though I have 2 films above it that were nominated for Best Picture. I do think this one deserves all the merits it got. I went at length talking about this on Picture This, so I'm not going to go any further, but the cast is great. The style is great. It's a great film, and it deserved the win there.
How did we end up here?
Coming in at number 6, we have Beyond the Lights. This is a film by Gina Prince Bythewood, and I didn't know much about this film at all. I had seen a poster for it. I think the poster doesn't really sell it very well. It's just a girl with sunglasses, and that's it. And you really don't know what this film is about, but this film is about a lot of things, and it's all about a lot of fascinating things. It follows this girl, Noni Jean. You see her when she's a young girl, raised by her white mother, and then you see as she grows up, how this kind of star-making turn as a pop star kind of has its benefits, but how it also has its severe downfalls. And you start to see how through this relationship with this cop who essentially saves her life, you can start to see how this connection forms and how she's able to kind of find the true meaning of her roots and try to find the humanity that has been lost because of this kind of ascension to stardom. And I think this would actually work as a really great companion piece to A Star is Born, starring Lady Gaga and Bradley Cooper, because it deals with similar things. The idea of when you become a star, how much of yourself gets lost in the process and how you're able to reconnect with that self and that sense of self.
That night on the balcony, you were screaming, "I see you." So, just what do you see?
And especially as this woman who's a black woman with a white mother, that dynamic is very fascinatingly explored here. You also just have her own relationship with the way men perceive her, because she's almost kind of sexualized in this world of pop star music as well, and how she kind of reclaims that. It's just a fascinating film. It has so many great things to say. It's, again, kind of one of those more slice of life films. It's just kind of following this very gradual, beautiful character study. It doesn't have a ton of bells and whistles. I think the one downfall of this film is that the musical numbers numbers themselves aren't very impressive. I'm not as much a fan of the music in this film, and I think if this film had like really great original music, kind of like A Star Is Born, this could be like an all-timer. But this was one of my favorite first watches for this retrospective because it was a film that completely surprised me. I think Gugu Mbatha Raw gives one of the best performances of that year.
And did you ever tell me that you didn't want this when I was on that balcony?
And it's just wild to me that she didn't become a bigger star because of this film, because she is just one of the most captivating actresses I can think of. Just having watched this film, I would love to see her in a million more things, and I'm surprised her career hasn't taken off since. But this is a really, really wonderful little film. It's a film that I think is probably one of the more obscure ones on my list, but it's one that immediately when I saw it, I was like, this is one of the best of the year, and I'm surprised more people don't talk about it. So if you want a great romance story, a great story about music and a career and stardom and what that does to someone, and a great story about mother and daughter and that kind of disconnect and connect at the same time, that really interesting bond, something like you might see out of like Lady Bird, and this kind of push and pull of like, do you love each other? Do you hate each other? Do you hate each other and love each other?
You want to be a runner-up? You want to be a winner?
And I just think it's a very fascinating film. I think it's one of the best works of Gina Prince Bythewood's career as well. So I highly recommend that one.
Saw this?
Lyrics. No one cares what I have to say.
I'm listening.
At number 5, we're back with Jake Gyllenhaal talking about Nightcrawler. Now, this is one of the first like big mainstream Jake Gyllenhaal films I saw, and I remember at the time being like, this actor is like one of the best of all time.
I'm a hard worker. I set high goals. My motto is, if you want to win the lottery, you have to make the money to buy a ticket.
And I still stand by that, and it's still surprising that he not only hasn't won an Academy Award, period, but he didn't win for this film, because this is his best performance, and I think the best performance of any man of that year. I just think it's a incredible work from Jake Gyllenhaal as this character Lou Bloom, who kind of is like that kind of Bickle taxi driver type character where he's doing some very immoral things, but we're still so intrigued by this character that we want to lean in and see what happens next. It follows him as he follows a bunch of these crime scenes in LA. He starts to film them and starts to realize the power he has of capturing these raw crimes in the most close-up way possible, and he gets a lot of great attention for his news footage. And then he starts to essentially involve himself in these crimes to get better footage. And it kind of is this great commentary about the media and press and how far people will go to get the perfect shot, to get the acclaim, to get the attention, even if they know they're going about it in immoral means. I think it's a really smart lesson to tell, especially nowadays, in the way the media kind of has their infiltrations in everyday life, and sometimes how that infiltration becomes intrusion and becomes a bit of an invasion of privacy. I also love the dynamic between him and Riz Ahmed's character as this young kid who just really wants a job, but is kind of used and manipulated by this guy and taken advantage of and essentially used as a shield for him.
No, I mean, I don't have a TV.
Do you have a cell phone?
Yeah.
Does it have GPS?
Yeah.
Congratulations, you're hired.
Okay.
And how this character really has no sense of remorse or empathy for anyone. It's a very cold character, but in a film that is very high energy and manic and chaotic. It almost feels like a Safdie Brothers type movie in the way it's stylized and the way it moves a mile a minute and the way it kind of builds stress as well. There are a few moments of come down, unlike the Safdie Brothers movies, where I feel like there were a few moments where I could kind of catch my breath. But even in those moments, there's that underlying tension and fear and suspense that I'd love to see in a movie like this. I think Dan Gilroy is a director who hasn't quite kind of matched the brilliance of this film yet, but is someone who I will still have my eye on because I think he hit it out of the park with this one.
I think Lou is inspiring all of us to reach a little higher.
At number 4, a director who I love very, very much, Christopher Nolan, Interstellar. I think there's been so much that has been said about Interstellar that I don't necessarily have to tell you. The way he explores new worlds, quite literally visualizing black holes and creating some of the most gorgeous images we've ever seen on screen. The way he uses the screen to fill all these beautiful textures and colors and production design and digital effects while also blending with practical effects. The first hour of it, not even in space, but kind of taking in this gorgeous scenery of these cornfields and the dust and the dirt. I mean, he is such an atmospheric filmmaker, and this is his most atmospheric. And he's also a filmmaker that I feel like gets kind of talked down upon when it comes to his emotion beats and like the fact that his films are rather cold. And I do agree with that for the most part. I think he's a very cold filmmaker, but this is an example of a film that kind of goes the total opposite route, where it's so ingrained in the emotion. There's so many big sweeping emotional beats of this thing that it almost doesn't feel like Nolan at times, because it gets so raw and emotional. That scene where Matthew McConaughey is sitting and watching these tapes, realizing how much time has gone by, and watching his kids grow up before his eyes, and realizing how much he's missed because he's on this space mission. And when he's in space, time passes slower than it does on Earth. It's a really heartbreaking scene, and it's one of those scenes that gets me just sobbing and sobbing. And I realize that I don't really cry at a lot of Christopher Nolan's works because they're much more intellect driven. It's much more driven by the plot and the interesting themes and the interesting concepts and the very imaginative worlds, where I'm never really swept up in the emotion of it all. I think there's moments of The Dark Knight that get there. There's certainly moments of Oppenheimer now that get there, but Interstellar is by far his most emotional film, and you can tell it's also his biggest labor of love in terms of the story he's telling and the emotion he's trying to get at. This is a family film in the sense that it does kind of talk about this really unbreakable bond between father and daughter, and how terrible it is when you have to leave for the betterment of humanity, only to find out that maybe you didn't have to leave that bond after all, and maybe what you're going for and what you're trying to explore and trying to discover is going to lead you to nothing. But it ends up leading to something. It ends up leading to something really fascinating and thought-provoking. And just the way this film ends always has me on such a high. It is one of those films that I think top to bottom is just such a brilliant vision through and through. The only thing is that because it is so heavy and so long, it is very dense. And I think for Christopher Nolan films that are usually so quick and so fast-paced, I think this one really takes its time, which is beautiful to see, but is just not necessarily one that I rewatch as much as I watch something like Memento or The Prestige or Oppenheimer or Dunkirk or Dark Knight. You know, there's other films that I probably would have an easier time just rewatching than this one. But when I do watch this, it's always such a magical treat, such an epic treat. And it really is one of the defining sci-fi masterpieces of its time. I remember in junior year of high school, I had to do a project. It was for an AP chemistry class where we had to literally take a movie and talk about the science of the movie and try to prove whether or not this science only works in the movie or if it's an actual feasible science. And some people did some really fun experiments, like someone tried to see if Rapunzel's hair could withstand that amount of weight and tangle. Someone did a project on would that amount of balloons and up actually be able to carry a house. My group, bless their hearts, Connor and Jake, if you're watching, shout out to you guys. We did Interstellar, and we actually explored the science of like gravity and time and if that is actually a feasible thing, and black holes and all that stuff that honestly at the time really went over my head. I felt like the group member who kind of smiled and nodded and went, yeah, good job, guys. Good job. Great job. You're doing great. I felt like the kind of useless group member. I did a lot of the research for the film because part of the presentation was we also had to talk about the film and what the film is about. And I took that kind of reign. I talked about the history of the film and the way they made the film and the way they visualized these black holes. But those two really took the lead on the science of it. But I remember at the time just being still so fascinated by the science of it. And it really shows how much attention and love and detail Nolan has to really research these topics and really feel the authenticity behind something that is essentially fictionalized in a way, but still bringing a realism to it as well, and trying to justify all these scientific ideas and make them real hypotheses, and really kind of share his scientific findings through this really cinematic, beautiful story. It's just a film I love, and I'm very happy to champion it here in my top 4.
You need to tell me what your plan is to save the world.
Moving on now, the next 2 films actually are films I didn't love when I first saw them, and I revisited them and I adored. And at number 3, we're going to have David Fincher's Gone Girl. This is a film that I saw back in the day, 10 years ago, with my high school girlfriend. We saw a double feature of this and Annabelle. We actually watched Annabelle first at like 6 o'clock, and then this was at like 9 o'clock. And I'll just tell you, we were so worn out by the terribleness of Annabelle that we were watching Gone Girl, and admittedly we were both very tired. We weren't really enthused because Annabelle put us at such a low. And while Gone Girl, I enjoyed it, I just never really got it. I never really understood the hype and the love for this film because of that terrible double feature, pairing it with such a bad film. But watching it on its own 10 years later, I hadn't seen this since I watched it in the theater 10 years ago, and I freaking loved it. And it was just one of those films that every single minute I was leaning in. I had almost kind of forgotten what this film was all about, and then it started to kind of click into place. Just the way you're able to see 2 simultaneous storylines happening at once. But I also love the idea of the unreliable narrator, where you're watching these 2 simultaneous storylines and you don't know at which point which side is true. And maybe they're both not true. Maybe they're both true to an extent. Maybe this is what these characters actually believe is happening. But I think it's a really interesting narrative device to watch these two simultaneous storylines and not necessarily know what is fact, what is fiction. And that really creates a very distinctly unique viewing experience because you're always constantly questioning things for yourself and kind of trying to figure out and get to the bottom of this story. But it is an engaging story. It has a really engaging narrative. I think all the supporting players are really great, like Tyler Perry and Carrie Coon and all the policemen in this film, the detectives, and just the way this film builds and grows and builds in the suspense and then kind of sticks you with this ending that just makes you feel like absolute crap, but in a way that makes so much sense with the story that you've seen up till then. It's just one of the best films of that year, and I love it so much. I am excited to finally do my David Fincher ranking later this year because it won our March Madness tournament on our Facebook page, because I'm excited to watch his whole filmography because I feel like Fincher's a filmmaker that the first time you watch his works, some of them work instantly and some of them, they're really entertaining, they're really good, but there's that little extra something missing. But I think every time I've gone back to a Fincher film, having seen it once and liked them, and then watching them again with a few years more maturity and experience and just more being more well-read with cinema, and just having more knowledge of cinema, I've really grown to appreciate a lot of his works even more on a second go, and Gone Girl is no exception. And honestly, at the end of the day, this might be my favorite Fincher film. It's either this or Social Network right now. Who's to say there might be another third Fincher film that comes out and knocks them all out of the park. But it kind of reminded me why Fincher is kind of known as one of the GOATs, because he is utterly fantastic in what he does. So Gone Girl, huge recommendation for me. If you haven't seen it in a while, go revisit it. It is an amazing, amazing story.
I feel like I could disappear.
Moving on to number 2, I talked about this on Picture This, but this was also a film that I didn't love when I saw it for the first time, and I absolutely love it now, and that is Wes Anderson's The Grand Budapest Hotel. This thing, top to bottom, the most gorgeously directed film I may have ever seen, or at least of the last 20, 30 years, because the way every single ounce of this film is designed, the production design, the way it's edited, the colors, the use of contrast, the performances, the style, and the tone of the line deliveries, the comedy interwoven with the action and with the drama. This is a well-oiled machine, as well-oiled as any machine could be. Every single cog is in place to create an utter perfect masterpiece of a film. This is a film I didn't love at the time. I think some of the humor went over my head. It was almost too many characters to juggle at once. I didn't necessarily understand the appeal. I could acknowledge that it was really cool to look at, but I think it was just style. It was like the substance and style debate of this is style over substance. But I think style is substance in the case of the Grand Budapest Hotel, because every single ounce of this craft, it just shows how much care Wes Anderson has for this material and how much effort he puts into his vision in creating something that is so singularly unique. Even within his own films, this feels like its own kind of epic journey, because a lot of his films are very contained. They're very personal, smaller pieces with whimsical worlds, but they don't kind of stretch as far as this film does. This film stretches way beyond anything I've seen of Wes Anderson. It just goes to more heights in terms of the scale of the film and the design, but it also kind of exceeds the bounds in terms of location. There's like this whole sweeping action sequence with like skiing and the mountains and snow. It's just these big swings that I just never really expected Wes Anderson to make, that he makes, and he absolutely knocks out of the park. This is a film that top to bottom I am just in love with, just foaming at the mouth, loving every single moment and every single second of visual splendor that he has to offer. And it's just a really fun premise. It's a really fun story. It's a really fun kind of a crime film, if you will. It also becomes a really great prison film. I have a thing for Prison Break movies, I've realized, because I love Paddington 2, I love Toy Story 3, I love Shawshank Redemption, I love The Great Escape, I love A Man Escaped. I mean, I really, really love a good Prison Break movie, and Grand Budapest Hotel also fits within that. So I think this is just one of the best assemblies of script, acting, visuals, style, tone I've ever seen.
She's been murdered, and you think I did it.
Hey! Stop! So, yeah, Grand Budapest rocks, but there is somehow a film better than it, and it is my number 1 film of the year, which is Whiplash. Now, this should come as no surprise for anyone who watched Picture This. This is my favorite film of the year. It has been my favorite film of the year probably since 2014. At the time, this was always in the circulation of like my favorite films that I would recommend to people, because it is kind of a smaller film. It took a little while to kind of catch on and get this kind of big following. But now, especially seeing Damien Chazelle make La La Land and Babylon and First Man, these, really great films, I think people have now come around to realize that this is really his first true masterpiece of many other masterpieces.
Were you rushing or were you dragging?
I don't know.
I just think he's a director who is so exciting to see right now. The way he's able to tell a story in such small proportion, but make it still feel so big and epic. It's kind of the inverse of Grand Budapest Hotel, where everything in that film is so grand, but still so meticulously detailed. Here, everything is so small, but still so grand in the details. And I just love that about this film.
If you deliberately sabotage my band, I will gut you like a pig.
Oh, my dear God. Are you one of those single-tier people?
You know what? I said it. Jake Gyllenhaal, the best performance. I'm second-guessing that because I think J.K. Simmons actually is the greatest performance of 2014. I honestly forgot about him because he's such an anomaly.
You are a worthless pansy ass who is now weeping and slobbering all over my drum set like a 9-year-old girl.
His performance is so good that I almost don't even consider it amongst all the other performances of 2014 because it stands above it in a way that like Heath Ledger does for The Dark Knight, or like Javier Bardem does for No Country for Old Men, or Christoph Waltz does for Inglourious Bastards. What's the common thread there? They're all really great supporting villain performances, and I think J.K. Simmons is another great example. But even more so than those other three actors, I think J.K. Simmons brings somewhat of a humanity to the sociopathy that his character has that also makes him so intriguing and so engaging, because sometimes what he's saying actually makes sense, but it's done in such a manipulative, asshole, awful way, and just like such a condescending way that you still don't want him to win. You don't want him to succeed, but you also understand why he's doing what he's doing to push his students, even though he does cross the line several times. It's, again, a really interesting play of morality.
Don't worry about the numbers. Don't worry about what the other guys are thinking. You're here for a reason. Have fun. 5, 6, and.
I think Miles Teller is fantastic in the role. He often gets overshadowed because J.K. Simmons is so good, but I think the two go toe-to-toe so well. And I think that like last 5 to 10 minutes is quite literally the best filmmaking of the entire century so far, in terms of just a single sequence that is just riveting, the perfect blend of sound and action and editing and acting. It is just absolutely superb through and through. I think Whiplash is one of those films that is already withstanding the test of time really well and is going to continue to do so. I really think it's a 1A, 1B situation because I really do love Grand Budapest Hotel, but Whiplash is still my favorite film of 2014.
There are no 2 words in the English language more harmful than good job.
And so there you go. There are my films. 2014, my top 14. I was brief on some of them because I've covered them on other episodes of other things, but I hope you enjoyed this list. I hope I made some recommendations for you, especially some of the lesser known ones. I hope you go seek them out, and some of the ones that everyone talks about. I mean, everyone talks about Whiplash and Gone Girl and Interstellar, but there's a reason they're the basic picks, is because they're really, really good. So I'm very glad I could champion in those films. And stay tuned, because next year we're doing it again for 2015. We're talking about Spotlight. We're talking about Mad Max Fury Road. We're talking about Room. We're talking about The Revenant. It's going to be a great year. But that's a year from now. I get to kind of relax, and as we ease on to the end of the summer movie season into the fall spooky season. But this was a really fun retrospective. And as I said, all my retrospective reviews and my full ranking of all 90 films I saw in 2014 can be found in my Letterboxd, which I will link below. So thank you so much for watching, and let me know down below what your top 10 or top 14 of 2014 is, and if there's a film that you wish I had brought up on this list and that might not be on my Letterboxd, let me know down below. I'm still looking for recommendations. Just because the retrospective is over doesn't mean I can't ever watch films from 2014 again. And I'm sure there are still so many that I haven't seen that I need to get around to. But thank you so much for watching, and take care. And yay, thanks for joining this retrospective. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks.